Hi, I'm Chris,
And I'm Candice,
and this is Candid Conversations on Leadership.
where we have authentic conversations where we share our experiences and talk about leadership.
Great. Candice, how you doing this week?
Pretty okay. I've been on jury duty, so I was anxious, but not anxious.
You feel like you have a lot going on?
Not really. It was actually a welcomed opportunity where I could block my calendar saying, don't schedule anything. I'm
Right.
on jury duty.
That's the beauty of jury duty, right? Is when you don't get on a jury and you have all this free time because nobody scheduled any meetings, right?
Yes.
It's actually a great segue into the topic we want to talk about today. And that is this idea that a lot of times in our lives, we have so many things on our lists. We have commitment to work, we have commitment to family and friends, and commitments to ourself of things that we want to do. And it can seem just overwhelming at times.
Unsurmountable.
Yeah, do you feel like that a lot?
Yeah, sometimes. How do you do it all?
Yeah, I know. And when a few weeks ago, I gave a presentation, a keynote presentation, and I was talking about this concept of letting the right things go as a sort of a way of prioritizing your life. And afterwards, I got a lot of feedback from the folks that were in the audience. They're like, I want to know more about that. Like, how do you actually let the right things go so that you can really focus on the things that you need to? And one of the things I talked about there was this idea that commitment to yes requires you to say no a lot.
Exactly.
Right? Do you find it hard to say no?
Not anymore, but at first, yes, I'm a people pleaser. I love to say yes. Yes, of course we can do that. Customer service, my thing. But eventually you learn.
Yeah, you get to a point where there's just so much on your list. And so today we wanted to talk about, our stories about how we do this. Maybe some tips and tricks for folks that are watching or listening to the podcast about, how do you actually do this? How do you figure out what the right things are to let go?
Excellent. Whew. So Chris, how do we do that?
Well, I think there's two buckets that I kind of put this into. One is, how do you do it organizationally?
Mm-hmm.
And then how do you do it personally?
Perfect.
Right. And so organizationally, I think it's the term that I use, the phrase that I use a lot, and people kind of look at me funny when I say it, is you have to learn how to speak truth to power.
Tell me a little bit more about that, because those are one of those buzz words, buzz phrases.
Yeah, I know. I don't normally like buzzwords, but and I think I may have kind of co-opted it from somewhere else. But I think it is this idea that when somebody that's, your boss or in the leadership in your organization, or even a client comes to you and says, I need this from you, right? And they're adding something to your already long, insurmountable list. How do you figure out how to meet their needs, right? If we want to, if we're both in organizations that are, basically customer service organizations there, and you want to meet everybody's needs, but how do you do that in this place where we have constrained capacity? I mean, do you feel like your staff are they sitting around with a lot of free time in their hands?
No, they're always busy. But how do you have those conversations with leadership if you're always busy?
Yeah, for me, it is making sure that they understand that, this is our current capacity. Mm-hmm. These are the things we have on our plate, and being really clear about that. And first of all, making sure you're doing really good work, right? That you're using your current resources well, right? Mm-hmm. And if you can show that, you can show the successes that you've had.
Excellent.
Then you can have the conversation with somebody who asks you for something new, and have that conversation that says, okay, if you want us to do this new thing, what on this list of things we already do, can we stop doing? Right. So that's one way of doing it.
I see that. And I have definitely given that advice to people early in their careers. Sometimes it's difficult to have those conversations, but when you're doing great work and you can show that you can accomplish a lot, sometimes it's easier to have that conversation. But what do you do when your leadership comes back to you and they're like, I hired you to do all of this work?
I think there's the other side of that is you can ask them for more. Right? Mm-hmm. If you can say, you still want us to do all of these things we're doing, and I can show you that we're at capacity doing those things, and you want us to do this new thing, then have a really rational argument that's supported by data, and say, we need either an outside resource to come in and help us. We need to hire more people. We need to bring this new technology in to make this part more efficient so that we can focus on this new thing. So it's a matter of either getting rid of something that you're already doing or bringing in more capacity in some way.
Yep. So you're asking them, what are we going to stop doing? Or how are you going to give me more resources or give us more resources so we can still do quality work?
Right. Absolutely. And one of the things that, and this kind of gets to my second point when I'm thinking about this idea of letting the right things go, is how do you help the people that are asking you for things? How do you help them decide what's more important? How do you help them prioritize?
Right.
And for me, that is looking at our organizational goals and saying,
hopefully they exist.
Right, exactly. That's the thing. And I'll get to that in a second, but I think the thing that really works is looking at if the organization has well-articulated goals, you can say, these things that we're doing right now, they don't actually point to any of those goals. They don't help us accomplish any of those goals. So maybe we can actually get rid of those. You think we can't, but maybe you can. And but you said if they exist, right? And I think that there's this in a lot of our organizations, they don't have goals, right? They haven't sat down and gone through that process. This is a really good opportunity to help your leadership think about that, because if they don't have goals, all of these requests are just going to keep coming in and you have nothing to align yourself with. And so when we're thinking about what are the right things we should be doing, we as leaders sort of need to back our organizations up, kind of get at a higher level and say, where do we want to go? And why do we want to go there?
Wow. So you're going to be strategic
Yeah.
instead of operational. I'm sure your leadership is going to love hearing those conversations.
Yeah. And I think some of us are lucky that we have leadership that thinks strategically, but there's a lot of leadership out there, people that are in management leadership roles that don't have a lot of training and sort of experience in kind of having those strategic conversations. But you shouldn't ever be deciding what we want to do until you've decided where we want to go and why we want to do it.
Of course.
So that's that's kind of how I think about it from an organizational standpoint. Then we shift to the personal. And so let's talk a little bit about how maybe you do kind of personal prioritization in your own life. And then I'll share some of the stories about mine.
Work-life balance is not my jam. That's not my jam. That's not what I get down with. So I usually use an analogy of juggling. So often there's lots of priorities that we have. And when I think about it, you can juggle a lot of balls in the air at the same time if you're a good juggler. However, there's sometimes in this analogy, some of those balls are crystal balls. And for instance, my family is in a crystal ball. And if you drop a crystal ball, what happens, Chris?
It shatters all over the
shatters,
place,
it
right?
can break. So therefore, when I'm juggling all these multiple things, I make sure that one of my higher priorities, the ones that are in crystal balls, don't fall. However, I may drop another project, a small project at work. And if I drop it, that's okay. I can pick it back up. I can delegate. I can do other things. But those things that are highest priority to me in my personal life, those are the ones that I can't let drop or crack. And so I really encourage people to think about, what are those crystal balls for you personally? And that's going to allow you to let some of the right things go.
So aside from family, that's something that I think is important to a lot of us. Like, what are the crystal balls that you really value?
So I usually have I do a lot of soul searching in terms of things that drive me internally. So I have some very strong values, one of them being lifelong learning. And so I'm always kind of connected to that. Collaborative is a goal that's very much a value for me. Another thing that's very connected to me is inclusion. So these are things that when I think about my values, if it aligns with that and I'm like, okay, integrity, collaboration, inclusion, then that's kind of how I personally go about things.
So it's similar to what we were talking about with organizational goals, is you have sort of personal values and things that are really important to you internally that you want to have alignment with in the things that you're doing.
Of course. Yes. I definitely say that a lot of people will say, trust your instincts. And I'm like, what does that even mean? What is trust? But again, it goes to me going, oh, those values, those things that I hold true, if I can do that. And then if that aligns with what my organization does, great, cool. We're in alignment and we can move forward. And so I'm very excited and happy. And I love working at the University of Illinois because wouldn't you believe it? A lot of those values that I have overlap with the university's intention.
Yeah.
So
I love that idea of sort of, instead of trusting your instinct, trusting your values, because our instincts can actually be off kilter sometimes, right? That thing that our initial reaction to something doesn't necessarily align with our values. Like, we're not perfect people. And so it's to have that idea of, when I'm making a decision, don't go with that sort of gut feeling, but actually say, does it align with the things that are really important to me? That's a great way of looking at that.
Thank you.
So any other ways that you kind of personally prioritize?
One of the other ways that I try to personally prioritize is I think about my future goals. And sometimes that, you talked about aligning things and other things happen. And one of the programs that I'm in recently, you mentioned 360 last time we talked, a 360 degree evaluation where you get a lot of feedback, critical or not critical, about your work efforts. So you ask your supervisors for feedback, your peers for feedback, your employees for feedback, just anybody under the sun. Hey, give me feedback on how I'm doing.
360s are awesome.
Yes. So one of the things that I like to talk about is sometimes rejection can be redirection. And so there's
sometimes— Tell me more about that. That sounds interesting.
So there's sometimes where you're going to be told no. It's not going to work out. Maybe you didn't get into grad school. Maybe you didn't get to the job you wanted, whatever it is. And sometimes you can use that as an opportunity to redirect you in a better way. And so I'm not saying that they say no and you give up. That's not what I'm saying, because it's not a failure. But sometimes you can look at it as an opportunity for you to reevaluate how you want to move forward. And so sometimes when I've gotten critical feedback about something, I've decided to use it as an opportunity to pivot.
Well, that's fantastic. I'm sort of reflecting in my own life to think about, like, are there places where I've been told no and it ended up being a really good thing for me? And I think I would say there's a couple of jobs that I've applied for in the past and I didn't get them, and that was like hard to take. It's sort of this sense of, oh, I'm not good enough. I didn't make the cut. But if I look back on it and sort of look at the path that I took instead, it ended up being so much better for me. So I really appreciate that, Candice.
To be reflective. Yeah. Understood.
So I think some of what you're saying overlaps a little bit with what I would think about how I personally manage my priorities. But one of the things that I've struggled with over time, but I think I've gotten a good handle on, is what I call managing the tyranny of the urgent.
Tell me more.
And this idea of all this input, there's all these requests coming in, there's all this information coming in. And when it arrives, it can feel like that's the most important thing when it shows up. The perfect example of this is your email dings and there's something up there like, oh, I've got to pay attention to it. And that just doesn't work very well if you're constantly paying attention to those. And so there's a tool that's called the Eisenhower Matrix. The Eisenhower Matrix maps urgency and importance along two different axes. And then you look at, it creates 4 different quadrants, and then you can put your activities, the things that you are supposed to do, in one of those 4 quadrants. And so it could be that you have something that falls in something it's urgent and it's important. And those are the things that you really need to have in your short-term focus, right? They need to be done right away. They're important for your, achieving your goals.
Yep.
Let's do that. And then you have something might be urgent, but not important. And those are the kind of things that maybe you can delegate to somebody else, or think about, is there a way to automate that process? That's something that needs to be done quickly, but it's not that important. You don't want to spend a lot of your time. And then you have things that are important, but not urgent. And those things, you really have to think about, how do we plan for those things, right? We want to make sure they get done, but there's not a real urgency to them. But that doesn't mean we can put them off forever. So, have sort of a long-term plan of how to getting those things done. And then there's the not urgent and not important. And it's amazing how much of our time we actually spend in that quadrant. I would put email in that quadrant.
Procrastination projects.
Yeah, procrastination projects. It might be, flipping through social media, whatever that might be. You need to get rid of those things, right? They're wastes of time in your life. And I have a kind of a bit of a...
But they bring me so much joy, Chris.
They do, right? And so sometimes they bring you joy, but if you're spending so much of your time...
Then what are you avoiding?
What are you avoiding? What are you not trying to get to? And I have a kind of a quick trick that I've started doing. I started doing it a couple of years ago, and it's yet to sort of bite me. So I think it's a solid idea. If I get to a point where my email inbox is like 1,000 or 2,000 messages long, and I'm like, it is just, yes, it is. I'm never going to get through that. So I go and I will take the top 2 weeks, and I'll triage those things, right? That's the most recent things. Anything older than 2 weeks, I highlight the whole thing and click archive.
Yeah.
It has never bitten me, because if something is really important that's in there that I missed,
it'll
pop back up. Somebody will remind me, hey, Chris, you haven't responded to this email. I'm like, oh, sorry, I got busy, whatever. And then I'll respond to it. So that is a great way of that feels so good to just say, all of a sudden your inbox goes from 1,200 messages to 5.
Yeah, I guess. I do the same thing. However, the number does not bother me. I don't care if it was 3 million. Once it's read, I'm done looking at it.
Yeah, that's even better. So that's one way I kind of personally prioritize. Another way is this idea of focusing on what I can control.
Yes.
And it's things that I can internally improve in myself, or to kind of change in my situation. There's so much about the influx of things coming in that I can't control, right? I can only influence our organizational leadership so much to stop kind of that flow of things. There's external change that I can't control, but I can control myself, right? I can decide I'm not going to do something. I can decide I'm going to do something better. I can get rid of some bad habits. One of the examples of this that everybody has in their control is like turning off notifications on your devices, because we all get that dopamine hit when we see that badge, right? We see that 1 or we see that 2 that pops up. Yeah. We're like, oh, this is really important, and most of it's not important. And it might be important if your job is a social media job, right? That you need to pay attention to those. You need to be sort of in the stream of things, but most of us don't. And so making sure that we are kind of buttoning up all the things that we can button up in our own lives before we start kind of blaming the outside for us being not having the right priorities. And then the last thing that I think for me is really important in this prioritization effort is not letting other people's emotions become my emotions. And so when people come at me with fire, or a fire alarm maybe is the better analogy, I'm going to sit back, and instead of like responding right away to their heightened emotion, I'm going to go, is this really that important? You can sort of do the Eisenhower matrix really quickly in your head. Yeah. Like, okay, is this really urgent and important? And do we need to do that? And when you have that ability to kind of back up a little bit and see whatever the issue is, for what it is, then you don't necessarily have to jump to it and put everything else aside.
Right. So you can come at it at a calm way. You can delegate, but it doesn't have to become your emergency because it was their emergency. So Candice, I want to make sure that in
in kind of going through all the topics that we're going to go through on leadership, that we're always, being honest with ourselves about how good we are. We can sit here and we can kind of talk about, this is what we do, and these are all the ideas, and this is the best way, the best practice of doing these things. But we're not perfect, right? We're not. On the way in today, I was listening to Sirius Radio, and I heard that song, "The Reason." That's like, it was some '90s anthem, whatever, and it starts off by singing, "I'm not a perfect person," right? I'm not going to sing it because that's not my thing.
No,
but,
thank you.
But that like struck me, like, we have to be like real here. We have to kind of say, okay, these are things we know we should do, but we're going to fail sometimes.
It's okay.
We're all going to fail.
We can be vulnerable. We can share some intimate / powerful moments.
So I want to make sure that when we do this, each one of these episodes, that we're sort of having that sort of come to reality moment at the end and going, where are the things that we struggle? So in this kind of prioritization topic, where do you struggle, Candice?
In terms of letting things go, where do I struggle the most? I will say it has to be with the last one, in terms of letting, when I mentioned allowing rejection to become redirection. Sometimes I still take it very personally when someone says, "No, I didn't like this," or, "Candice, you really should do X, and you should do it this way because this is how it's done here." And I take the feedback and I move forward. But if I want to be very specific, there was some feedback that was given by one of my peers, and they said, "Candice, I really don't appreciate that we got this topic all done. We got this project done, but I didn't feel like I was included." And I said, "Thank you for letting me know. In the future, it'd been great when we were going through the project for you to let me know that as we were going along, because when I did ask for your input, it wasn't received. So I kept moving forward and proceeding. And I was going to follow up with you afterwards of how to get you involved, but we had deadlines to meet and it wasn't there." And they said, "That's the thing. You moved way too quickly. You moved too fast. It was done. So I didn't feel like we really collaborated." And it was this back and forth of like, "But you could have did this, but you could have did this." And at that point, I struggled to just say, "Candice, just why are you continuing to belabor the point? You should have just let it go." But I again, the next day I sent a message and I was like, "Oh, well, let's try to fix it." And eventually, after like 3 messages in, and it was obviously not sinking in that I did not let it go, I got some outside counsel from someone else, and they said, "Why are you still responding to this? Is this a priority? I thought it looks like you were done." And so I said I had to definitely just release and say, "I'm done." So I still struggle to this day to let certain things. The project is finished. Why am I still emailing about this? And I still struggle with that. So
I used to. Somebody once introduced me to the phrase, "What's more important, the relationship or being right?" And it sounds like maybe you struggle with, "Hey, I want to justify why I did something the way I did it," and that's, we spend a lot of time and effort in sort of mental space trying to prove that we were right, and that can, in most cases, that's kind of a waste of time, right?
Yeah, and I would feel like if I was on the outsider, I would have seen this immediately. I'm like, but for my own self, I had blinders on.
That whole "I'm right" thing is hard to let go of,
but I know I'm right.
Yeah, exactly.
But for you, Chris, what do you still struggle with? What's your big struggle?
So I think for me, I find it easy to sort of get rid of the little stuff that's not important. I was talking about just archiving my email and things like that. But when my list of the big things, the things that you can't just archive, that you have to pay attention to, when that list gets too long, I go into procrastination mode.
Oh, welcome to the world of life.
It is, and often I will be deep into that procrastination mode but not realize I'm there, because the way I procrastinate is not by sitting around and doing nothing.
Oh no.
I procrastinate by creating projects that are essentially make believe, right? And I think for me, like, I know that I'm procrastinating when I've gone into my iTunes library and I'm starting to reorganize my playlists, right? That's like a key thing for me. I'm like, I am putting something off because my iTunes playlists are just fine the way they are. But it's when that list gets so long and there's so many pressures coming in from the outside, you feel out of control, or I feel out of control. And that ability to go in, and whether it's iTunes or whether it's, cleaning the house or kind of reorganizing your desk, and that those sort of things, those tend to be just space holders because they create this sense of, oh, I'm in control of this. I feel better. I feel more secure. I
You're
am
bringing me back to my grad school days.
Yeah.
When I didn't want to write, I would just reorganize my works cited page, and I would find up more literature reviews, and I would go, oh, let me go ahead and dive more into this topic, and I would just reread articles instead of actively working on writing.
I still struggle with that, and it's but at least I kind of can see that I'm doing it. Sometimes it turns into doom scrolling through social media or news sites. Sometimes it turns into watching Netflix over and over again, but most of the time it is I'm creating a project that doesn't really need to exist, and I know that I'm doing it then.
I'm glad that you're able to be self-reflective on that point.
As we wrap up today, Candice, I think we've hit on a lot of really great ideas for letting the right things go. But for me, what it comes down to is I know when I'm not doing the right things, right? You feel it deep inside. And I think that's maybe what I would leave everybody with is you're going to have this gut feeling of whether or not you are focused in the areas that you need to be, whether it's a gut feeling from outside pressure, whether it's kind of this just internal feeling that you have. And that's what it's not instinct, but it's that pure gut feeling.
And always, we invite everyone that's listening or watching to share what their thoughts are in terms of how they are letting the right things go.
Thanks, Candice. We'll see you at the next episode.